This video has everything you need to know about building a brand new commander deck.
I'm Mia, and I really like soup.
I'm Beezy. I don't like it when it's cold outside. We're the Nitpicking Nerds, sponsored by Card Kingdom. It's the best place to go, whether you're trying to buy new Magic cards for yourself or sell Magic cards to fund more purchases of later Magic cards. They've got the best system. You can buy a bunch of cards from the site, free shipping orders over 50 on singles, and then you can sell the cards back to them that you don't want to just fund an infinite cycle.
We love Card Kingdom. We love how they treat their workers and us. And if you want to tell them that we sent you, use our link in the description below and go order something really cool or pre-order. We're also sponsored by Dragon Shield, best sleeves in the multiverse.
Good sleeves.
If you use the code
Nerds
at checkout, you can save 5% of your real money tax dollars on your entire order.
Kind of a big percentage when you think about it. If you buy $100 worth of things, that's 5% off. That's just some quick math.
$50 is 5% off too.
Wow.
You could get 5% off your entire order, no matter the total.
Those numbers are wild when you really get down to it. Moxfield's also a sponsor somewhere later in the video, but we've got another thing to talk about, which is limited edition extended art playmats by quite possibly one of the greatest living Magic artists today, Magali.
Magali's art is gorgeous. I loved her Secret Lair stuff, and just looking at this, just the extended art, I feel like I should pick up a couple myself.
Because we've got a Kickstarter. This is a Kickstarter for these mats. You can go there, it's live, buy the mats. This is the time to do it. Obviously, this is a limited time deal, so I'm showing them now. I'm telling you now, but don't miss out because you're going to regret it because this is some pretty sick stuff.
Our link is in the description below, so all the info's right there.
So what we've got today is our brand new Nitpicking Nerds Commander deck building template. It's basically everything you need to build a commander deck. If you're wondering exactly how we would do it, this video is for you.
We talk a lot about strategy and new cards to play and upgrades, but if you don't know exactly where to begin, well, this is a pretty good guide for you.
Yeah, so we got to start the best way we know how. Before you even build your deck, I'm thinking there's a few things you got to do. First, I think the most important thing to do when building a commander deck is to find your commander. You actually have to decide who is going to head your deck. This is important for a couple reasons to decide. First, because you get access to this card every single game, all the time. So you want to make sure the rest of your deck is created with this card in mind. This is the most important card.
You also want to find your game plan. There are some really vague strategies out there. You can say like Graveyard, and it could be anywhere from like Marin to Carador to something completely different. There's a lot of Surveil lately. There's a lot of like Dredge. Like there's so many ways you can take a certain theme, and each commander is very different. So picking the commander and picking the direction you want to go with it is very important when you're building your deck.
Yep, once you have your commander, it's notable to find, well, what can I do with this? Because like, you know, if I look at a commander like Tristani, it's like, well, what can you do with this? Well, I can gain life, I can make a bunch of tokens, a bunch of small tokens, or I can make a bunch of big tokens to gain a lot of life all at once, and then I can weaponize this. But yeah, that's all predicated on who your commander is. So you need to figure out your commander first, then you can figure out what direction to take it in and say, well, now this commander wants cards that do X, Y, and Z, so let me look at those first before building your deck. Just important, you know, consider what your commander actually does, what synergizes with it. Does it care about artifacts, creatures, certain types of spells, a certain method of having combat conducted a certain way? Totally, this is where you sort of get the skeleton of your deck.
I'd also like to point out that when you're building your first deck, there are a lot of suggestions online, but these suggestions aren't always compatible with one another. For instance, when you do Atrax's Praetor's Voice, that is a very toolboxy commander because Proliferate can go on a lot of things like poison, 1/1 counters, planeswalkers, etc. But if you go to EDH Rec, you'll see a little bit for each category, and that alone won't make a very cohesive deck, but if you focus on one, you'll make a much better and consistent deck overall.
All right, but we got the commander. We picked that. We're ready to go. Now we get to go one by one, every category of the deck. How would we build it? What are our general recommendations? And we're going to start with the lands. So the template numbers we would recommend here, 34 to 38 lands. These are numbers we're very comfortable with. I only have like 2 decks that fall outside of this range. It's a pretty small range, and I have like 23 decks.
I feel that way too. I think I only have one that isn't CEDH that falls outside of this, and that's because it's Elf Ball. So you're playing a lot of cheap elves that just act as lands because they're mana dorks.
So that's 34 to 38, and of those 34 to 38, 1 to 4 of them we're recommending should be MDFCs. This is our favorite type of all time. It's modal double face cards, but only for lands. There's a set of MDFCs from Zendikar Rising. Specifically, they are lands on the backside and spells on the front side. We use them to sub in as part of our 34 to 38. So I could have 34 actual lands and 4 MDFCs in my deck, which would give me 38 lands total, because since you can always play them as a land for the same cost as a land, which is just put it from your hand on the battlefield, we count them functionally as lands, and that lets us cheat it a little bit. It helps mitigate flood, and it helps mitigate land screw.
They're absolutely great, but you do have to remember that on the back, they'll only ever tap for one color if you're playing them as a land, unless you have something else that lets them tap for another color. So you have to keep in mind that if you're playing 3, 4, or 5 colors, you shouldn't be swapping these in left and right with lands if you do need access to a lot more colors.
Yeah, 1, 2, and 3 color decks is where I'm mostly playing MDFCs. 4 and 5, rarely. You will play maybe 1 maximum. But other than that, I'm looking to jam like 1 to 4 in my deck because they're all so powerful. It's so nice to have a land that is not a dead draw ever, or a spell that is not a dead draw ever in the early game when you can just play it and develop resources. It kind of turns Magic into Lorcana, and that's pretty useful. It's important to note that there is a relationship between card draw and lands, and I know we haven't gotten to card draw yet, but the more card draw you put in your deck, that's generally the more lands you're seeing as you filter through your deck. So that number might change a little bit as you get a ton of card draw, or a ton of lands might want a ton of card draw to play your lands. And it's a whole thing. It's all interwoven together. But that's just a note for the future. But yeah, generally 34 to 38, I say, is the sweet spot. Obviously, every one of your openers needs land. You got to make sure that you have enough lands in your deck to where your opening hands are functional and you have plays for like the first 4 turns of the game.
Another note about lands is that make sure you can actually tap for your colors. There are a lot of really cool lands that tap for colorless or only one color, and they have other effects stapled onto them, like card draw, unblockability, things like that. But if a lot of your spells have a lot of pips in them, you might not be able to cast them if you put too many of these utility lands into your deck.
Yeah, this is not a mana-based guide video, so we're not going to do exactly what lands or dual lands to play. We're just going to get to basic numbers, and we're going to move on to ramp.
Ramp is a really big part of the Commander game format because it lets you play your spells on time. This is consistent mana production, and this is things like mana dorks, mana rocks, actual ramp of like spells, and just like everything that makes you be able to have more mana than when you started.
Yep, for ramp, we're going to recommend from anywhere from 9 to 15 ramp spells. Like Mia said, ramp is anything that makes consistent mana production, so I'm not really necessarily counting a Pyretic Ritual as ramp, but I will count something like Smothering Tide that makes treasures consistently, which makes mana. It's a little tricky for some people because some people disagree what counts as ramp. Once you pin it down, 9 to 15 is what you want. To figure out the definition for you, we have ours. 9 to 15 is definitely what it is. The type of ramp can vary from color to color or deck to deck. Typically, ramp is safer if it puts lands into play than if it sticks around as a permanent, because permanents, the non-land permanents, are much more susceptible to removal or getting caught up in a board wipe. But generally, lands are not going to be destroyed because of the EDH like code of conduct. It's not really something people do.
There's a lot less land destruction, especially mass land destruction in Commander. You might see like a destroy target permanent spell, like a Generous Gift, and it might be used on like one land, like a Nykthos or something really, really powerful, a Gaia's Cradle perhaps, if people are running it. But it's usually generally safer to have more lands out than artifacts that can be swept up in like a big Vandal Blast or something. But you also have to remember to tailor ramp to your commander, like the amount of synergy that commander has. There are elves that come down that will put lands into play, so you might not want to play spells that do that instead. Or if your commander actually helps you ramp, you might not want to put more ramp spells in if you have direct access to your commander like we all do.
Yeah, if your commander costs 2 mana and it ramps you, well, that should factor into how much ramp you actually need, because that's going to be your turn 2 play like every game. There's also the flip side. If your commander costs 4, you probably want to ramp into it on turn 3, which means turn 2 plays, turn 2 mana rocks, turn 2 rampant growth type things. Those are going to be really critical. Similarly, if your commander costs 3, you really want to accelerate it out on turn ahead of schedule. That's turn 2. So now we're talking Llanowar Elves, maybe Lotus Petal-y type stuff. I wouldn't necessarily count that as ramp, but that's what you need to factor in to get that thing out a turn ahead of schedule. Also, if you're thinking 9 to 15 is a lot of ramp, I know a lot of people recommend 10. Typically, I have just been more satisfied with using my critical early game plays on just developing my mana and ramping and getting to the point where I'm going to cast 6 drops on turn 4. I'm going to cast 7 drops on turn 5.
I mean, it suits you early or late game because early game you're able to play those spells quicker and late game you're able to play more spells. So I don't see it hurting you unless you're getting flooded with so many ramp spells you have nothing to play.
Yeah, that also is another way that card draw and ramp work together. Just make sure your deck's not like, if you have 50 ramp spells in your deck, you're probably not accomplishing much. I think some big mana decks that are really mana hungry probably could support like 20 ramp spells. Because we're not only saying rampant growth is a ramp spell. There's some spells that are like a creature that ramps you, or it has another effect when it enters or when it dies, something like that. So it's not just, mindless ramp. It's other cards that ramp and maybe do something else for you. They all count towards ramp as long as they're giving you consistent mana production. Next up, we got removal. And by this, we mean anything that affects the board negatively for your opponents. We want to take cards off of their board. So this is anything that like counter spells, board wipes, things like Yawgmoth that aren't necessarily the most pinpoint kill your thing removal, but they take resources away from your opponents. They affect their board negatively, take things off the board. Spot removal, obviously, Swords to Plowshares, Doomblade, that kind of thing. Bounce, taking things off their board, putting them back into their hand, that's removal. Fighting, all of these things, that is what we are counting. What we are not counting as removal or interaction like this is mill, discard, graveyard hate, protection spells like Teferi's protection. These ones don't really fall into the category that we're talking about, so that's not what we're including. They don't affect the board as much.
Board wipes do count as removal, but we are going to be talking about them in a little bit later of a section.
Yep.
When we talk about how many removal spells that you want in a deck, we think that from 12 to 20 is a good number. And I know what you're thinking. That's really high. I think that it might sound a little bit high, but because it is so all-encompassing with counter spells and like swords and just bouncing things, that you do have room for these in your decks. Plus, there's room for synergy. They could be stapled onto creatures or lands or a lot of things that can really work with your deck to make it kind of like the full package.
Yeah, we talked about something like Yawgmoth counting as removal. That's just a card you're going to put in your deck. Some people might not consider that removal or interaction. I definitely do. So things like that are going to like maybe not kill a creature outright, but interact negatively, bounce a creature, or put some negative counters on it, or just make them sacrifice something. Those I'm all counting. So counting board wipes and all that stuff, I think you can easily get from 12 to 20, especially since there's a lot of removal that just synergizes with your deck. Plague Crafter is a classic one. If I'm playing a bunch of little dumb creatures that all have death triggers, and when they die, I can happily put Plague Crafter in my deck because that does something for me. It also happens to serve as removal, and that's just one example of how we can get up to 20, no problem.
But when it comes to removal, you have to know your color's limits. There are certain colors that are good at removing certain things and others that are not. For instance, with green is great at removing artifacts and enchantments, but it doesn't really have a lot of board wipes. So you should keep in mind when you're choosing a commander and you're building this deck, it's like, should I incorporate another color to help with that if I have trouble with removing that? Or is there another way I can kind of work around that to help me if I got into like a sticky situation?
And yeah, no matter what color you're playing, no matter what strategy your commander is employing, you have to be able to take off your opponent's game pieces. You have to be able to take them off of the board, or else you're just not going to be able to handle things, especially in a 4-player game where everyone's trying to do their thing. Statistically, someone's going to do it before you. And if you can't stop them, the game just kind of devolves into this weird who got there first, who's playing the most ramp and win conditions, which we'll get to. But I like to help mitigate that with removal. I don't think there's anything wrong with playing a lot of spot removal. I think there's a way to play removal to progress your own board state and take things off of their board state. This does not have to be zero sum. There's no board state ever. I'm not going to make a 3-hour game. You can play 45-minute games where there's a lot of removal.
I really like removal too because it's the back and forth of Magic. We can interact at instant speed a lot of the time, which a lot of card games don't let you do. So I think that's one of the really fun things about like why you chose to play Magic and Commander. But when you pick removal, you have to consider whether it's proactive or reactive removal. Are you trying to get something off the board completely once it's already there? Or do you know it's going to hurt you before it even hits and you need something on the stack to remove it?
Yeah, there's a couple different options like that. In colors, exile versus destroy is another thing you want to consider. Some of the better spells exile, but some of the other commanders have synergy when things die. So that's totally a toss-up. It's great. It makes it so that you don't see the same 11 removal spells every game. When we play 12 removal spells in all our decks, they're not the same 12 removal spells. Everything is different. It's great. It still gives you that like singleton format feel. It's not just Source of Plowshares your guy, Source of Plowshares your guy, Source of Plowshares your guy in every game. It's different.
Moving on to card draw or card advantage, because we got to get to our game plan. This is the type of category where it just puts you up cards immediately or over time. This is going to be things like Esper Sentinel, Factor Fiction, Bolus the Citadel, Light Up the Stage, and Evolutionary Leap. I know this is kind of like a weird smattering of cards, and you might not always think of them as card draw, but over time it's going to get you more cards than you originally started with.
Yeah, Esper Sentinel is an example. It triggers based off what your opponents do, but we can assume, and it is proven through just gameplay, that this does trigger. Opponents will be giving you cards through it. Factor Fiction, just to straight up put cards in your hand right now. It's more than one. We'll get to that. Bolus the Citadel, you're not putting new cards in your hand, but you're casting and playing new cards that from a position where you didn't have access to them, so that's card advantage. Light Up the Stage, you're spending one card to get access to two cards for an extended period. That is card draw, as far as you ask us. And Evolutionary Leap, a repeatable sack outlet which generates creatures. That is also card draw. It's sort of like giving you an idea of what we actually count. Now, what we do not count as card draw is cantrips. Preordain, Ponder, Brainstorm, these are not card draw because you spend one card and you go up one card, so you're even. So playing these cards endlessly will not put any more cards in your hand. You can resolve Preordain, Ponder, and Brainstorm, and you'll still have the same number of cards in your hand afterwards as before. And also, we're not counting Thrill of Possibility. I don't think this card is even close to card draw. It doesn't put you up cards. You have to spend one card to cast it, one card to discard, and you're up two cards, which is net zero. So I have no interest in these personally, and also they're just not card draw in the way we're going to talk about it.
They're slowly making red card draw better, so we can break away from things like Thrill of Possibility. When it comes to card draw / advantage, we want to go with about 8 to 14 per deck, stapled onto things like enchantments, artifacts, creatures, etc.
On the lower end of that, more towards the 8, we're talking about your commander probably draws cards or can tutor in some way, and you have repeatable access to some of your best things. So that's when you don't need a ton of card draw. It's not that important. But when you go to the upper end, close to the 14, maybe even higher range, you're a mana-hungry deck. You're a card-hungry deck where if you can generate all of these ramp spells and get up to 10 lands, then you're going to want card draw so that you can put more stuff in your hand, because if you run out of gas, it's disastrous. Game over.
It feels so bad when you have a bunch of lands and you're just top decking and you're like, okay, well, pass. This is not what I need right now, and it's not the time for it. It feels so bad. So it is very important to keep card draw in your deck. But there's a few different types. There's a one-time burst. That's things like Harmonize or like Night's Whisper, where you just draw them immediately, versus repeatable card draw. That's like if you're waiting for Esper Sentinel. That might take a little bit more time, but you will get more cards overall over a longer period of time.
Yeah, you probably want to mix and match. You don't want all one-time bursts, and you don't want all repeatable or contingent on some kind of trigger happening. You want to mix and match so that you can keep the cards flowing throughout the game. And you also don't want to just card draw, go up to 14 cards in my hand, discard, because that's not going to do you any good either in most decks. So card draw is a very interesting one. You definitely need card draw. And we wanted to make sure our lower limit wasn't like 5, because I don't think there's decks running around with 5 pieces of card draw in them where I would say, yeah, this is a healthy deck, because we see these decks peter out and fizzle and die all the time. We play so many games, and card draw is like the most important thing that if you leave it out, you're really going to feel like you're not playing Commander sometimes.
If you don't have a hand, you're not playing Commander, and if you're not playing Commander, you're dead in the water.
Next up is board wipes. This is a subset of removal. We are counting board wipes towards our removal count, but we're going to give them a separate thing because people are always wondering how many board wipes should I play. It's one of the like categories of Commander cards, so we're recommending 1 to 4. I think if you're not playing competitive, you probably want at least 1. The thing about board wipes is they are a great way to recover when you are behind in a game, and that is almost guaranteed to happen at a certain point in a game. It's pretty reasonable to assume that I'm going to be very far behind in a 4-player game where I'm only one of those players. So having these in your deck is one of the best ways to catch up from behind.
There are a lot of types of board wipes too. The Destroy, the Exiles, the -X, damage board wipes, sacrifice board wipes. There are board wipes to get around everything that you might encounter, like the indestructible creatures or the things that just are really sticky, you know what I mean?
People assume that you need a ton of board wipes in Commander because it's great card advantage to destroy everything, and I actually don't really think that's true. We'll get to that in a second. I really don't think you need more than 4 as long as they follow a certain rule that we will mention. But that's just something I wanted to note. There's other removal spells that can help press the advantage when you're ahead. You don't just have to reset the board every time.
There are one-sided board wipes too. For instance, I play a vampire deck, and there are certain board wipes that will omit vampires from the board wipe itself. This is like Kindred Dominance, Olivia's Wrath, those sorts of things. And you can find these board wipes and kind of use them to your advantage to keep all of your stuff intact and kill everyone else's, or just make sure you have the most at the end.
So there's also modal board wipes, which have different options, and they don't necessarily always say destroy all creatures. Farewell is a classic one. You can exile artifacts and enchantments if you're ahead on board with creatures to keep that going, or they can even be a full reset button on the entire game. But when you add 5+ symmetrical board wipes, this starts to, in my opinion, lead to these miserable games that people talk about, and it gives board wipes a bad name. When you play 5 Damnations in your deck and you just have 5 full resets for creatures that don't help anybody in particular, this is when we get to like 3-hour games that are complete slogs. But we're advocating more for like 2 full reset board wipes and maybe 3 one-sided board wipes that are going to take out your opponent's things or leave opponents heavily devastated that you can just dominate the game from that point.
I think it's really important when you keep board wipes in your deck, you think 1 or 2 for myself, just to make sure that if I'm falling behind, I can just symmetrically wipe it, and 1 or 2 if you are trying to gain advantage. For instance, if you have a ton of 1-drops in your deck and you can build them up to really, really big using like counters or something, you might want to wipe the board and have more board wipes because you can rebuild faster. Or if your win con is like contingent on a lot of things dying, you might want to include more destroy board wipes because that helps your game plan. It's not just a symmetrical board wipe.
Let's move to another important aspect of Commander deck building. I would say this is one of the most important ones because without these, you can't win the game. It's win conditions. We are advocating for around 2 to 3 win conditions. We do have to define this because it's a sort of nebulous term. What do we actually mean? You have to envision your end goal with your deck. So what are your finishers? If your deck is trying to make a bunch of tokens, how do you turn that into a W? Are you trying to sacrifice them, all of them, and goblin bombardment somebody? Or are you trying to attack and make sure that whatever creatures they have are irrelevant because you have either so many or they're so big that it's just completely overwhelmed? I am not going to count regular combat damage as a win condition. We're talking like attack you with a 6/6. That's not a win condition, and I don't think anyone is really helping themselves out by saying, my win condition is to attack with a 6/6 4 times.
We have too much life for that, and in general, if people even have a little bit of life game, it's not practical to just say I'll attack with a 6/6 or I'll attack with 3 1/1s for 20 turns and hope everyone dies at the end. So when we talk about combat, there's a few ways we can talk about it. First, we can talk about over-the-top combat. This is things like Craterhoof to buff your entire team, or Taunt from the Rampart to make sure you're attacking and they can't block. This is also things like if you want to talk about Voltron, that is technically like damage through combat, but it's commander damage. So if you can get to 21 instead of like trying to get to 40 plus if they're gaining life or something.
Yeah, exactly. You can't just go for regular beats. This isn't limited. We are going to need to push over the top in a pretty big, meaningful way. Like Mia said, with either a ton of damage, unblockability, or some sort of like cheating the damage where I can just do it all with my commander and then I don't have to attack you with anything. I just need 1 creature out. You don't want your win cons to be useless in any other part of the game. Higher power win cons sort of have exceptions to this. So like Craterhoof, it's kind of a dead card if you're not about to win. If you're doing anything other than about to win the game, it's completely useless. However, it's so good that when you are about to win, it changes the math entirely. It lowers the bar for what is required to win. It's completely off the chain. But then we have other options like, we get to like Avenger of Zendikar. Well, this isn't as fast of a win con, and I would almost hesitate to call it a win con, but it's also useless in the late game. And it's like, well, which one I'd rather have? Obviously, I'm not comparing the two directly, but you'd obviously rather have Craterhoof.
When it comes to things like combos too, there often are combos where like 1 or 2 of the pieces will be useless outside of it. So I would like to suggest that if you are trying to build your deck around a combo or put a combo in your deck, make sure you can actually use a couple of those pieces outside of it. One of the suggestions is I really like the Aetherflux Reservoir and Sensei's Top and Bolas' Citadel because Bolas' Citadel is really good advantage, and top you can kind of look at the top 3 cards and then just kind of rearrange them as you see fit. So these can be useful elsewhere.
Yeah, and Aetherflux Reservoir is like the least useful piece of that. but having 1 out of 3 is not as bad. When we talk about these 3-card combos, so let's say Blast Top, Citadel, and Aetherflux is a good example. These 3 cards, to me, are 1 win condition. It's not like I'm playing Aetherflux, and I'm playing Top, and I'm playing Citadel, so that's 3 win conditions. That is 1 way to win the game. That's an infinite combo to gain infinite life and deal infinite damage. That's 1 win condition. Now we got to talk about, you have Crater Roof in your deck? Okay, that's a 2nd win condition. You also have Taunt from the Rampart or something like that. That's your 3rd win condition. So they kind of like can be groups of cards or 1 card individually that requires some kind of setup, like Crater Roof, just have a bunch of creatures and then you win, or assemble these 3 cards and you win. That's what we're talking about. So that's why we said 2 to 3.
It's also important to figure out what turn you want to win by. For instance, some people have really cool 4, 5, 6 card combos. Those are really hard to assemble, especially if you're not playing tutors. So that will be a lower power deck despite having infinite combo as its win con.
Yeah, assembling your win cons faster means you have a stronger deck. If you can win the game on turn 3, that's really strong. It requires not a ton. Let's say Thoracle, Thassa's Oracle, and Demonic Consultation. It's the classic, it's the easiest way to win the game in Commander because it only requires 3 mana. So if your deck can do this by turn 4, you've got a really strong deck. But if your win con requires 5 or 6 pieces, or it requires 60 creatures in play, and you need a couple anthems to pump them, that's going to lead to slower decks, and you're just going to need to factor this stuff in when you sit down for Rule 0. Our next segment is going to be Mana Curve. This is a big one because it's going to tell you how often you can cast spells, how expensive your deck is on average, and this is going to be a really quick guide of what number of spells do we play at each mana cost. So our kind of catchphrase for this is that the first 5 turns of the game are really important and they set the pace for the rest of the game, whether you're trying to cast 12 drops or not. So it's really important to just not take those turns off. Very frequently you'll see a player go land, 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 and then they'll play something for the first time on turn 4. They are at such a huge disadvantage.
They really are, because it's not like we have a spell counter, but if you are setting yourself up for better plays later in the game, you're going to be so much more better ahead. That was not grammatically correct, but it doesn't matter. For instance, if someone drops a Plague Crafter and they only have 1 creature and it was the creature they played on turn 5, they're going to have to sack it and they didn't do anything prior. That feels so bad.
But sometimes that can just feel like you lost the game. So it's important to get plays underneath you, get some things going. So we'll start with 0 drops. Mia, how many 0 drops do you play on average?
On average, I play 0.1 across 16 decks. All of my numbers are across 16 decks, by the way.
Mine are across 20 decks, and I play 0.7. There's not a ton of 0 drops to even play. The best case scenario, there's something like an Everflowing Chalice or something that you kick that is actually designed to be played higher up. We're really not going to see too many 0 drops. We're not playing competitive, so that's totally fair. How about 1 drops?
Across all my decks, I have 8.3 1 drops. These are things like Esper Sentinel in the higher decks, and then my Llanowar Elves in the lower decks. Every single turn counts, and I don't want to be taking off turn 1. I'm
pretty similar. I'm at 7.1. This might seem high, but we value getting on the board as early as possible. We're not talking CEDH. We're not playing, I mentioned we're not really playing the Mana Crypts and the Jewel Lotuses and stuff. This is Llanowar Elves, Springleaf Drum, Wayfarer's Bauble, maybe a Skull Clamp, or those types of things. We really value getting on board as early as possible. Even the difference of a 1-drop play versus not a 1-drop play, it can make a ton of a difference in a game. And we have, with this many, I think we have impact the board a lot earlier than most people tend to do.
I also talk about this a little bit when I talk about talismans a long time ago, but those 1-drop plays are pretty important. That's why I prefer talismans over signets, because I have a lot of 1-drops, and with a talisman, I could tap it immediately for a 1-drop that we usually have in our hands at that point.
Right, 1-drops become relevant even later in the game when you can sandwich them anywhere in your curve because it barely costs anything to play them. So if you have a 4-drop on turn 5, you can follow it up with a 1-drop, and it just leads to all these little incremental things that help get your game plan going, smooth out your draws, and just put you that much farther ahead of people. How about 2s?
2s, that's where kind of the meat of our decks get going. Mine is 15.9 2-drops. I feel like a lot of my spells congregate between the 2 and the 3s.
Mine is 16, and if you were to graph this out, this is the peak for us. We play the most 2-drops of any mana value. Again, we're not playing demonic tutors. These are mostly signets, cantrips. It's a little bit of card draw, some engines like an evolutionary leap or some kind of setup pieces. Early creatures. We just want to get on board and develop our mana and develop our cards and get the ramp removal card draw going, just so that the rest of our game goes smoothly. The higher end of our curve doesn't look super glutted. This is where we value affecting the board the most.
We can't really afford to take a turn off. We love playing removal, as we talked about earlier. And when you play a lot of removal and you play in pods that play a lot, you also have to have a lot of things to play so your one creature that you might play, if you're playing like land, pass, doesn't get swept up in something that just says everyone sack a creature and that's your only target. For 3-drops, I run about 14.2. We're getting into like the middle of our curves because I think that like turns 2 to 4 are some of the most impactful turns of the game.
Yeah, I'm at 15.7. So my 2s and 3s are about the same. I do love me some 3-drops. I like developing. I like getting my feet under me, just like the rest of this stuff. There's not a ton to add here. This is just our numbers. But I will say, just to add something, if you take somebody who plays a 1-drop, a 2-drop, a 3-drop, a 4-drop, and a 5-drop in a game, and you compare them to the board state of somebody who maybe only hits 3 out of 5 of those turns, I think the difference is like can be night and day, and I would give a huge favorite to that other person to win, the first person who played 5 spells in 5 turns.
I think it's more advantage too. For 4-drops, I'm running 11.5. I think that that's a little bit higher than yours, but I do like to cheat mana here and there, so I do think that this is where some of my like value engines get going.
Yeah, for me it's a huge drop off. I'm down to 9.5. A lot of 4-drops I try to cut. 4s and 5s are really where I try to trim a lot of the fat, air quotes, of my deck to get a similar effect just done quicker and sooner. I'm not trying to necessarily make my decks more powerful, although I do think there's an inherent power to that. I'll give up a little bit of frills, you know? If I'm cutting a 4-drop ramp spell for a 3-drop ramp spell that's slightly worse, that's a decision I've made because I think going faster at that point and building up my mana is more important than getting a bigger burst later.
You also have to remember, though, that when you are going into the higher mana values, it might be actually better. For instance, you love Druid of Purification. 4 mana, but it'll hit 3 2/4 targets.
I feel like that's you know what? That card is probably in like 7 of my decks. That's probably like a tangible percentage of this 9.5 that I play. It's probably 1 Druid on average
It really
in my decks at a 4-drop.
That's going to be me with Unexplained Absence soon.
Yeah, let's go to 5-drops.
I am at 6.5 5-drops. Again, I do cheat out mana, so my 6, 7, and 8s are going to be a little bit higher than average, I think, because they're not just finishers, but I am kind of subduing the costs of these.
Yeah, I don't play a lot of 5-drops. I'm at 6.3, which actually is a little surprisingly high for me. I have some decks with like 2 5-drops in it. This is not a mana value that interests me a whole lot. I don't find a lot of powerful things happening at 5, so my decks usually just don't have a lot of these. Weirdly, 6s is where I apparently play more than usual. How many do you have?
I have 2.9. I feel like with my decks, it's like the bigger spells are either congregated at like the 4 or 5, or they're like the 8, 9, 10s. You know, the 6 and 7s are kind of a bare spot for me.
Yeah, 4.3 for me on 6s, which is way more than I thought. Very interesting to me. Because we can talk about this right now. 6, 7, and 8 plus, we are not trying to have a lot of these. We do not need a lot of these. A lot of this is where your win conditions are going to come in. And I don't think we need more than like 2, 3, you know, maybe go up to 5 in a deck to have some redundancy. But it just like, I think the 6s and the 7s and the 8 plus mana value cards are what slow you down. And you can't have 5 or 10 8-drops in your deck and be doing what I was talking about smoothing out your draws on the first 5 turns and making plays every turn and at least affecting the board in some way. You just have all these virtual mulligans that are like, are you ramping? I hope so, because otherwise you can't play.
Especially when you get punished for mulligans and you only get the 1 free one, you start to feel it very fast. When it comes to 7-drops, I'm at 2.8. I feel like this is not real, though. I don't want to make excuses for myself, but I was checking my 7-drops and I was like 2, 1, 0, 0, and then I have a Kalia deck that's just fun, like nostalgia cards, and I had 12 7-drops.
Oh my god, yeah. I am at 2.7. Similarly, I think a lot of our 7-drops are meant to be cheated in. I think typically it's more likely to see 1 or 5 in our decks. We have a lot of decks that barely have any, if any at all. And then there's some decks that, like, you know, you want 7-drops because you've built your entire rest of your deck to ramp into these every game. That's where we get into like 20 ramp spells so I can cast my 5 7-drops. But generally, I think 2.7 is fair. Definitely, I think on average, without these outliers, we're probably more leaning both towards 2.
I think so too. And when it comes to 8 or above, I am about 2.2. This does count things like Blasphemous Act, though.
Yeah, I'm at 1.4. This is all the Eldrazi, Blasphemous Act, maybe some expensive stuff with Cascade. The Great Henge is going to count here. We didn't bother factoring in the virtual mana cost, so we really don't like 8+ drops a ton. Unless we're ramping to the moon, we don't value these, and we think they gum up our opening hands and they make the early game that much harder. And we've just seen, and like, I don't know how many games we've played against people who come up at cons and are like, let's get a game in. And it's like, great, where I just see that this is happening to them. I can't see their hand, but I know this is happening to you. You've got 3 8-drops in your hand, or you reveal it or something. Or, you know, we play a wheel and they go, thank God. But it's like their game plan just gets shut down by themselves, where they just didn't factor in their curve, and now it's all over the place and they can't cast their spells on time.
You see that, especially when people get land screwed too. They get stuck on 3 and then they're at like a permanent 7 because like, okay, play 1 spell, can't cast the rest of my hand. I feel bad for them. And, you know, when I first started playing Commander 2, I used to be like that because there's so many cool things at the top end, but you just can't have just a cool deck and have it also be functional and, you know, can hold up to a lot of other ones.
Yeah, I think there's an editing phrase called like kill your darlings, where it's like all of your babies, all of your favorites, they can't make it into a deck where you want it to run super smoothly, or you're looking to improve the power level. They can make it in for fun, sure, but if we're talking about like optimizing and what would we recommend for things to run really smoothly, you kind of have to pick like 5 to 10 of your awesome favorites, and then the rest, you know, they can go in a different deck. That's totally fine. To wrap up this topic with a nice little bow, we're going to talk about our average mana value, which is combining all of the mana values of the cards in our deck, the spells, not the lands, and then dividing them by the number of spells. So, Mia, your average mana value is 3.31, and my average mana value is 3.24. So that's what an average spell in any one of our decks is going to cost.
I thought this was pretty interesting because it's not like BZ and I really consult each other, but we both are mid-range players, you know, fully admitted. And so it's pretty interesting to see that both of our spells AMV are roughly around the same, you know, within half of a decimal point.
Yeah, and we do have some general notes, some like heuristics or rule of thumb just for mana values, so that you don't have to go, how many 8-drops and 7-drops and 6-drops and 5-drops do I have? You can just scroll down and look at the average mana value of your deck. And then I think this is just some general points. 3.50, I feel like, is kind of the casual sweet spot. You can play some clunkier things, but you also have a curve, and you're going to be developing the board. Above 4, if your average mana value is above 4, you're going to have to accommodate that in some way with a bunch of ramp spells earlier, or with a commander that can reduce cards so that they don't actually cost, you know, 5+.
The above 4 decks is just like, you got to make sure you have the card draw to actually get to the cards that you need to play prior. And just those fierce mulligans, I feel like, because that starts to hurt. Below 2, though, that's like kind of competitive. I feel like a lot of like those are the ad nos decks, you know, where it's like it won't hurt as much when you flip them off the top, and that's where a lot of your value creatures are there too.
Yeah, I really don't think you should be playing, you know, if your average mana value is below 2, I probably wouldn't be playing too many games with people whose average mana value is above 4. That's like just probably, unless there's some kind of reanimator deck, that's just not going to mesh very well. Below 2, you're definitely getting into competitive territory, because we're assuming you followed the rest of this template and you have win cons in your deck. So if you've put win cons in your deck and your average spell is still less than 2 mana, you are going to be very high powered, which is totally fine in the right pots. We also have to consider alternate costs with our average mana values and the cards, the spells of our decks. MDFCs, we kind of count them as costing 0, because I know they are a spell with a mana cost on the front and a land on the back, but that's not really how they are played out. What the play pattern actually is they are a land 80% of the time, and when we need them, they are a spell.
You should be considering the average mana value as, what am I usually going to be paying for this? For instance, with Blasphemous Act, you're going to usually play it into a very crowded board, and so it will only usually be 1 red mana because you're wiping so many things off the board. Another one is Force of Negation, or because you can exile a blue card from your hand instead, and so you won't be paying that mana cost.
Yeah, we haven't used alternate costs for this video for our template, but it's something you can do if you really want to say, hey, I'm never casting Blasphemous Act for 9, you know, let me get a different view of this deck. That's definitely something you can do. Totally fair. And the way to do it is Moxville.com. I would say you got bamboozled, but this is actually just a real part of our deck building template. I think Moxville.com is the best way to show all of these stats to yourself, because you can sort by average mana value. Again, this is the ad, but this is actually just real advice. It lets you see how many 4-drops, 5-drops, 6-drops you have, and then you scroll down and it tells you the average mana value. It tells you how many lands are in your opening hands on average. This is super useful stuff that sort of saves playtesting, and you don't have to go out and goldfish 10 times. You can just look at the Moxfield stats, and it really does help.
I really love Moxfield because, as I was talking about earlier, Adnos is kind of like, if you care about that, you're going to be hitting cards off the top for life. But if you have Adnos in your deck, the Moxfield app will actually just calculate it without that in it for your average mana value. I think that's a super cool feature.
It's super funny. But yeah, that leads me to the decks where you have really high mana values, but the commander totally mitigates this. Just to give some examples, Kalia. It is a commander you're going to play on turn 3, or at least try to every time, which cheats out 7 drops and 8 drops. It makes them 0 mana. Henzi reduces the cost of all of your big creatures that are going to make your mana curve look atrocious. And it says if I've cast Henzi 3 times, these spells are coming out for like 3 mana. And then Dragon, basically just take your entire curve and just reduce it by 1. So I see a lot of dragon decks where it's like 4.7. It's like, yeah, but not really, because all the dragons are 1 less.
I think that's definitely important to keep in mind. That I play like a Jalir deck, which is polymorphing. So it's like, oh, I'm not trying to play that many creatures because I'm trying to get to the big ones fast. So if you are playing strategies like that, take this with kind of like a grain of salt, or maybe add those to like the Moxfield thing where it's just like reducing the cost in general.
Yeah, I think it's like, I wouldn't want to just be like, my deck has an average mana value of 4.3. I would want to say, my average mana value is 4.3, but I'm doing this, this, and this to like mitigate that.
But enough about the cards themselves. We are going to tell about a couple general tips that we have. First, you can think about whether you want to build online and then start building it in paper, or if you have a lot of cards like us, sometimes I like to build in paper first and then start putting it online and filling in the little holes that I need.
Definitely something that I think you should decide before you build, but it's kind of just, 2 very equally valid methods. I like to build the entire deck online, make all of the cuts, and then see which cards I have from that. But some people would rather look at their entire collection because they're not trying to buy, that many cards for the deck, see what they have, and then sort of turn that and compute that into the online.
I think it's really important because a lot of people don't want to buy these expensive cards, and they want to try and like use what they have. So building that way can be really helpful. Another one is, what are your weaknesses? As we mentioned earlier, certain colors struggle with removing certain types of cards. So for instance, black has trouble removing enchantments. So you have to keep that in mind when you're picking like removal, and also like the colors that you might want to put in your commander deck in general. Do you want to have a more like fast and all in approach, or do you want to have a more mid-rangey style where you can handle everything like with ease and you won't be dead in the water?
Kind of something you do after you build your deck, and then it's sort of like the post game, because you're still going to be changing your deck, but you might build your entire deck, look at it and go, all right, so what are this deck's biggest weaknesses? Well, it's very committed to the board. It's going to commit to the board early and often, and so maybe it's susceptible to board wipes. So maybe I want like a Clever Concealment or a Teferi's Protection in my deck as a little bit of a stopgap to, I don't just lose the game if somebody plays a board wipe, which is very likely to happen in a game. And I'm playing a black deck, but I know that there's a lot of rest in peace type effects in my pod, and if I can't answer that, I can't win. So I'm going to need to get the Feed the Swarms into my deck.
But you'll learn this as you play, because, with every game you learn a little bit more about what your deck likes and doesn't like, and you'll eventually change it to, kind of have a more well-rounded approach. Also, mana efficiency. Don't bother using things that cost more for the same effect, like just a counter target spell. You could get that for 5 mana, you could get it for 3 mana, you could get it for 2 mana, and usually it's better at the 2 mana part because you'll have more mana to do other things. But also keep in mind that sometimes things that cost more can help your deck more. For instance, with Farhaven Elf in an Elf Ball deck, you get an Elf and Ramp, and I'd rather have that in an Elf Ball deck rather than like 3 visits where I just get a land but no body to go along with it.
Right. Consider the creatures that have ETB effects, so you can blink and reanimate in those types of decks versus the sorcery or the instant that does the thing one time and is more efficient once, but that you can never ever reuse. So that might be a form of card advantage that your deck gets the values from later in the game. Mana efficiency is interesting because you could take that approach. You could try to max everything and just go, well, what's the least I can pay for a counterspell? What's the least I can pay for a creature? What's the least I can pay for a win con? Usually the answer is lower than you'd think, which is kind of how we get to CEDH. But then you can balance that with synergy and go, all right, what's the lowest ramp on a creature I can get? Mana Dorks. Okay, then Wood Elves and that sort of thing. And you build from there. And there's just a ton of different ways to do this. And it's awesome. Building your deck is amazing. Building your first deck, building your 100th deck, it still gives you a rush. And we're going to send you to a little bit of an upgrade. We're going to upgrade one of the categories from this removal and tell you what specific cards we've been loving lately.